Our second panel of the day is a panel that we're calling, What Does the Future Look Like in Rural Minnesota? And we spent a lot of time, I will tell the panel, in the Red River Valley in North Dakota. And I was struck listening, as I know a little bit about both sides, how there's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences. And it reinforced for me, and I think for this commission, how important it is to get around the country and really begin that exploration. So we're going to have three panelists here. Benya Kraus, who is an old friend. She and I got to know each other when she was at the Booth School at the University of Chicago. We hooked her to prepare our Bridging the Divide conference. We did an urban-rural conference with college students and with a lot of experts, and she was our expert, and she is a rock star. You're so lucky in rural Minnesota to have Benya. She is an amazing person, so don't disappoint me and not do well today, Benya.
No pressure.
Yeah, like everybody who dealt with college students that they adore, they just want them to do so well. Ben is the former mayor on this end, former mayor of Fergus Falls, and really just an incredible civic leader. Known to really be giving a lot of thought of this, and maybe Ben, you can talk a little bit about what you're going to do at the end of the week next week, which is really pretty consistent. And then there's Mike Reese, University of Minnesota West Central Research and Outreach Center at Morris. And if I can just say one thing about Morris, Mike, when you look at small, publicly owned liberal arts colleges, the University of Minnesota at Morris frequently ranks number one in not just in Minnesota, in the country, as a place that has the combination of academic rigor and just an incredible community of support. And so this is such a great representation for rural Minnesota. And so Benya, we're going to start with you.
Now that the bar's been set very high. Thank you for having me. As Heidi mentioned, I am now about 4 or 5 months into my new role as President and CEO at the Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation. I understand the Commission has heard a little bit about the Initiative Foundations, but there are 6 sister foundations, all of us across greater Minnesota. We began about 40 years ago, started by the McKnight Foundation. Each of us have our own independent endowments that we've invested in over the years so that we can do grant making and lending in our regions. So I have the honor of serving a 20-county region in south central and southeast Minnesota. That's about 175 communities, and only a dozen have populations over 10,000 in my region. But of those that are above 10,000, that also includes Rochester, Minnesota, and Mankato. So we're blessed with 2 kind of urban centers as well as 12 micropolitan centers too, from Austin to Owatonna to Albert Lea. I'll share a little personal background. I call home both Bangkok, Thailand, and Waseca, Minnesota, the 2 sister cities everyone knows, and today live in Harmony. So it's a town a little over population over 1,000 people in the Root River Valley. Amish country is also what we're known for. So right in that southeast corner. I'll also share that I celebrated my 30th birthday this week, which I say because I think there's a lot of demographics there that might not quite fit when you think of what does a rural community foundation president look like. With that said, I previously started and led an organization that was all about getting talent to return back to their hometowns and pursue public service. And when I moved back to Minnesota, to Waseca, for that organization, all of our fellows begin with a listening tour of their place where they're serving. So again, when I started this role, I again went on a listening tour across our 20 counties. So I've probably now traveled all 20 counties 3-4 times over. And I want to share kind of 3 trends that I saw on my listening tour and that I'm sure I will continue to see and wrestle with as a region. One of them is not something that is unique only to rural places or rural Minnesota. In fact, the whole country is dealing with it, but is looking at the demographic cliff that we are encountering. And there's a lot of things that go into that demographic cliff. One of them, right, is that we're at a stage now within the next 5 to 10 years, if it's not already happened, where death rates have been and will be surpassing birth rates. The Center for Rural Policy and Development, led by the incredible Julie Tesh, presented to our board this week, and their research is phenomenal because they've been looking at the demographic cliff data for the state of Minnesota, not just in a point-blank way, but they go deep into the rural specifics and also disaggregate that data by RUCA codes. So you can also see it's not just all rural, but there's a mix of town rural, suburban rural, right? And that while the demographic cliff is affecting everywhere, there are certain nuances as well when you disaggregate by RUCA codes. So all across the board, yes, for the most part, we're seeing death rates surpassing natural rates or natural birth rates. But what has held some of the population gains and losses in different ways, according to these different, sub-RUCA codes, is, international immigration has been a big sustaining force of population. And what's interesting is that it's sustaining in all of my 20 counties. It's not that you've seen a huge uptake in the past 5 to 10 years of international immigration. It's actually stayed pretty steady, which I think is interesting because I think sometimes the perception is that it's increased at rates that we've never seen before, right? But it's stayed pretty steady, which has been helpful when you have your domestic immigration rate kind of fluctuating by county. And that domestic immigration is just people, domestically moving into our regions. So, a little bit more data on that. We also looked at what does this mean then for our workforce and our labor shortages. And I say it's labor shortages really rather than job shortages. We are seeing in many of our counties that it's really not that there's not enough jobs, but that there's not enough workers to be filling those jobs. And that's due then to a shrinking labor force. But yet, now I'm gonna say, right, so we're seeing shrinking labor force. I also said that people are having less babies. So then you might wonder, okay, should we be investing in young people in these places, given that there's not gonna be a lot of young people? And I guess what I wanna maybe end my statement here with is this idea of the importance of investing in young people, despite even these, not even despite, but because of these demographic changes we're seeing. So of a shrinking labor force, 77% of our labor force in our 20 counties have kids under the age of 5. So if we are to think of how do we make sure that our businesses can stay locally owned, be thriving economic drivers into our communities, that opens up this whole thesis about what does it take to attract young families. And absolutely one, that is increasing access to childcare. Even with declining birth rates, we are seeing the shortage gaps in our region continue to grow. 2 is we really need to be focusing on this housing churn of how do we free up more housing availability, thinking about creative financing tools for, sometimes even 8plexes or small density, low density housing needs that go under invested in by state and federal dollars. That makes a huge difference in being able to grow our small towns. We need to see good schools, and that involves cradle-to-career initiatives. So not just focusing only on K through 12, but working with our community college partners, thinking of effective CTE programs. We also need, fourthly, healthy young people, so that the people who grow up in our places are not suffering from the rates of what we are seeing on social disconnection, deaths of despair that have grown twofold, doubled in the past 20 years. And that means access to healthcare, access to mental health services, which are closing at a pretty exponential rate in greater Minnesota. And then finally, as a 5th point, is I think also key to attracting young families, and I know this both from personal experience, but as I walk and with people around the region, is these places of belonging. So as we think about the need for immigration, both domestic and international, to fuel and sustain our populations, how are we weaving together these ideas of home, both from what is, what can be, the homes that are mixing in, and how do we come together as a community to know one another, to know your neighbors? And I think this piece of where the third spaces in all of our communities, but focusing here on greater Minnesota in my region, what are the places where we know and build the social cohesion and trust among neighbors? And that could be your local coffee shop, it could be your farmer investor-owned oat processing facility. Third spaces look like so many different things, but when I think of rural belonging, it is also the capital investment as well as the people investment into the third spaces that allow us to know and work and build together.
Thanks so much, Benya. Mike?
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you this afternoon. Benny and I have a lot in common, one of which is I'm also about to turn 30. So everything else will be, I'll be as honest with you as I can. My name is Mike Reese. I'm Director of Operations with the University of Minnesota West Central Research and Outreach Center. That's half my role. I also am the research leader for renewable hydrogen and ammonia. I've been with the University of Minnesota for 27 years, located in Morris, Minnesota. And one of the roles is, again, Director of Operations for the Research and Outreach Center. We're an agricultural experiment station, one of 10 research and outreach centers throughout the state, and we focus primarily on agricultural natural resource science research. So for 24 of my years at the University of Minnesota, I was a renewable energy director. And from those experiences, we started looking at the opportunity to increase farmer profitability and community vitality, and as well as increasing economic development in our region. And we saw renewable energy as essentially a land resource, ability to use the land to generate biomass and wind and solar energy. And so from that, we embarked on developing a research program. And we started out looking at community scale renewable energy systems. We established two utility scale 1.65 megawatt wind turbines. We established a biomass gasification plant at the University of Minnesota Morris campus. I should say our research farm is not exactly part of the University of Minnesota Morris. We're part of our college, which is located in St. Paul, College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences. But we too are ranked number one in the U.S. Typically. Talking about that as well. But we work very closely with our sister campus. Through that process, I think we were very successful at developing these community scale systems, but we were recognizing that that did not necessarily mean that it translated into our Morris community. And so we began to engage with our community about how can we move forward and implement some of these technologies. So that grew into what's called the Morris model. So we worked with our city council, with our school system, public school system, with our hospital and area businesses and farmers, looking at what's the future of Morris in our rural community. Morris is about, with the population from the students, it's about 5,000 population, and the county is about 13,000, so relatively small. And we formed a steering committee, and we were working on projects. And at some point, we were connected with another program at the University of Minnesota, the Climate Smart Municipality Project, where we looked at an opportunity to partner with Saarbeck, Germany, and North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. And they are very similar in that they were an agricultural community of similar size. And that led to a lot of dialogue and some exchanges. We found out that we really needed to establish a strategic plan. And from that strategic plan, we recognized that, or we determined that we needed to have three big goals, and then a list of several projects. The three big goals were produce 80% of the power in our county, or energy in our county by 2030, become 30% more efficient, so use 30% less energy in our county, and then also at the same time eliminating landfill waste. So we embarked on those goals. We created a slate of projects around those goals, and we're well on our way. We were very fortunate that students at the University of Minnesota Morris campus were very engaged in this process, and they actually, once they graduated, became some of our leaders from an employee standpoint, sustainability directors with the city of Morris, and it was well received. It was picked up by national media, by the New York Times, Washington Post, other places. And I think one of the headlines in the New York Times was the city of Morris, Minnesota cools its beer in its city municipal liquor store with solar power. So that was not the title, but it was something similar. So it was a great experience. I think, and the nice part about it is that Morris has become a model for other communities to follow, and we continue to learn as we go forward. I think one of the main parts, my interest, having grown up in the community and still the family farm, is looking to generate local wealth. And when I say that, I don't mean the type of wealth that Bill Gates and Bezos and others have, but the type of wealth that supports our schools, our hospitals, our churches, social services, things like that, and develops capital to move forward. I recognize there's some bankers in the room and on this panel, but the old adage that banks never loan money when you need it, and so we want to be in a position where we don't need the money. So that we're able to continue to be vital and grow our economies and see a bright future. And I think we're well on our way to doing that. We should mention one last thing. The community is fairly split from a political persuasion. The rural area around Morris is ultra-conservative, and the campus is somewhat ultra-liberal. And those are some interesting conversations. And I think the way we engaged, not had conflict, but we engaged, was to just point out that we all have the same goal. We want to see our community a better place for our children and grandchildren, and now let's have a discussion to see how we can take steps together to make it that way. And so that was, and then also at the same time, let's leave out the national discourse out of our discussions, and let's just focus on our community, our schools, our hospitals, our services, things like that. So with that, thank you.
Brad, go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. Hi everyone. I'm Ben Shire, and thanks so much for being here. I am from Fergus Falls, Minnesota. Population 14,000 people. It's beer cooled by the sun, Mike. That's what you're looking for. And I'll talk a little bit about beer cooled by the sun because we are using that Morris model in some of the communities we work with. I'm from Fergus Falls. Just to give you a little perspective of where I'm coming from. So my wife and I both grew up in that town, moved back. I think people talked about that. Raised our 5 kids there. We started 2 Main Street businesses there, and I served 8 years as mayor of that community, 8 years on the city council, so I have 16 years of local government experience, and now currently working with West Central Initiative, which is a sister organization of Benya's in a 9-county region, 82 cities in this part of the state. So I work with 82 other mayors on some of these issues, and not going to be any news flash here, but I'll tell you that the issues are workforce shortage, their housing, child care, and infrastructure. Those are the issues that you hear time and time again when you talk to local communities. I would add a 5th, and that's mental health, that I think that we don't talk about as much. But I want to talk about the first 4 just a little bit, and I will say this, that federal funding is critical, but federal, state, and local partnerships are essential, and that's how these things happen. That's how projects happen, and that's how we move forward. So maybe I thought I would just give you 3 examples from my experience of how federal programs aren't working, maybe how they are working with partnerships at the state, and then some examples of how we are utilizing federal funds. So first, give you the example of a small community of about 100 people in the region. The 25 years so there's high nitrate. All the homes in the community have private wells and septics. High nitrate levels and rising arsenic levels for 25 years. So this safe drinking water for the community has been an issue for 25 years. There's federal funds available. However, there's some obstacles to utilizing those federal funds. Just as one example of preliminary engineering report to utilize USDA funds would be around $500,000 for a community of 100 people. That's just not viable if you don't know that you're actually going to get the funds or get the project, right? So there's state funding available. Actually, just this week, after 25 years, that community voted to go ahead with a $10 million plus extension of the nearest local municipal water project. with state funding, which is only about 80%. It's less than federal funding, but that same preliminary engineering report is about $50,000 if you utilize state funds as opposed to utilizing federal funds. So that's an example of where there's federal funds available, but they're not really accessible to a community. Second example is Fergus Falls, where when I took office of mayor, there were 20, not unlike many rural communities, there was 24 vacant storefronts in our downtown, and we had blighted industrial sites along our river, and we had big box stores leaving town. And we said, we're going to focus on our assets, we're going to rebuild our downtown and our river. And we did that, and there was a number of state, local, federal partnerships. But one I just want to, when we did those projects, there was a dairy that had been abandoned and dilapidated and contaminated for a generation in our town. And we used state funds we used EPA funds to clean up that dairy site, but we did it through the state. Like, we were not able to access those funds directly from the EPA. It took state partnerships. So again, it's that access to funding that's available, I think, is so critical. I think there is funding available a lot of times, but how you access those funds is really important. And the third example, I'm running out of time because I want to get to Mike's beer cooled by the sun. It's the Morris model, right? So we use the Morris model. So the Inflation Reduction Act there was 30% tax credits available, direct tax rebates available to communities for the first time as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. 30%. There's also add-ons, 10% for American made. You start to add up, so there's some real incentives for these programs. In Fergus Falls and this area, not just Fergus Falls, but the vast majority of those communities are served by Otter Tail Power, which is a private utility, and they offer a $1,500 per kilowatt rebate, which ends up on a small scale, 40 kW or less. Solar project ends up being about 50% of the cost of the project. You add that to a 30% tax credit, you're talking, and 10% Made in America add-on, you're talking 80-90% of these projects are funded. Well, what we found is these communities, even though 90% of a project is funded that's going to save taxpayer dollars, they don't access these programs because they don't have the capacity in these small communities. So providing funding is one thing, but having access to those funds so the communities. So one example is just down the road down near Ogama on the White Earth Nation, population 208. They're putting a 30, I don't remember the exact number, but it's less than 40 kW solar project on their fire hall to help that. It's going to save them, thousands of dollars, which, that doesn't sound like a lot to some of us, but when you're in a community of 200 people, those thousands of dollars can go to a community park or to a library or to something that can really benefit that community. So that's the example that we use from Morris, and I think that we can spread that out. There are programs, there are opportunities available to these communities, but the capacity in these communities just does not exist in order to utilize them. So I'll stop there because I see my time is up.
Okay. Brent, you're first one up.
I absolutely am, because
You
such a
thought
struggle.
I ignored you last
That's
time,
right.
didn't you?
So I'd like to hear a response from each of you on this. Trust is one of the principal resources that rural America has in greater abundance than metropolitan America. How do you proactively protect trust from the pernicious influence of the national discourse? I'm really curious about that. What is it that rural communities can do to nurture and protect that aspect of who they are? Because it's a vital national resource. It's also a vital resource in terms of the development of rural America.
Yeah, sure, I can start. A couple of thoughts on that. First of all, so those communities, the 10 communities that are utilizing those programs, I mean, the trust piece of it is, if we would have just walked in and said, hey, here's 80% from the that's available through federal, for a clean energy project in your community. If you just look at a map, you can imagine these communities are very conservative communities, right? That would have been a non-starter from the beginning. But we built that trust with people, so they trust that we're here to actually listen to what their concerns are, to listen to them. We showed up multiple times, and you have to build that trust. It's not exactly to your question, but I think that does. And I think understanding, I'm thinking about federal policy here now. understanding that rural places are not looking for a program so much as they're looking for an opportunity. And I think that if they can, I think about Mary's BNT Meets, right? Like that's an entrepreneurial pathway that exists in a community that you can't overestimate the importance of that in a town of Waban, Minnesota, population 400, right? And there are other opportunities. For example, that there's deer hunting is something that's very culturally popular in rural Minnesota, and a lot of people don't go deer hunting anymore, and I've heard from people because they can't get their deer processed. So consolidation is a big deal to local small businesses and main streets, and if you can create entrepreneurial pathways, again, it's not a program, it's an opportunity. I think that that's how you build trust in rural communities.
Yeah, obviously, a lot of people in urban areas don't know their neighbors, and we do. And in my case, I grew up with most of the people I work with and work around, and I think caring for the people is number one. You can have different views, you can come from different places, but at the same time, your neighbors deserve to be treated with respect and trust, and you need to care for them. And I think sometimes that's lost in urban areas. And one of my concerns is it's starting to get lost in rural areas because of the national discourse. People that I've grown up with and go to church with, and you hear some of the things they're saying now, and it's like, well, who are you? That's not the values that we grew up with. And I'm fairly conservative as well, having grown up in that space. But at the same time, we do have to care for people, and I think that shines through when you're working on projects and people see that. And the other part of that is being able to listen, because if you listen, you tend to understand better what people's issues are, as what was already mentioned. And I think listening is part of that whole aspect that's important for trust. And then also, as I said earlier, trying to isolate that national discourse, and because we can't necessarily solve what's happening in the world, but we can solve and make progress on what's happening, in our borders, whether that's your county, your community, your township. We can have an impact there.
I maybe will double down on, I think trust is built by doing things together. And that is both the civic associations that you are part of. Like, when I moved, my husband and I recently moved to Harmony, and our first day at Mass, we were invited to join the choir. and I think of all the churches when I was in Chicago that I went to, and maybe it's because I'm not as talented out there, but never once asked to join the choir, right? And I lived there for 2 years, and so I think there is I hold both. I think this native and newcomer identity, right? When I go to Waseca, everybody knows who my grandfather is. And even though I didn't go to high school there, I didn't grow up there, because I am Jim Zimmerman's granddaughter, there is a knowing of me, and I am not anonymous just by my association of family, which is such a blessing. And to have lived in places where the norm is that you are anonymous, I think there's a very human thing that we are not meant to live anonymous lives. So how incredible to be Jim Zimmerman's granddaughter. And I also am new in some ways to the region too. And with all that demographic cliff data that I just shared, the future vitality of our places is how we bring in newcomers. So I think, the adage, right, of that you can live in a rural community for 35 years and still not be from that community, it deserves a chuckle, but also that is going to be a hindrance to us. And I think what makes you belong to a place is the invitation to contribute to the place. And I think, now the MBA training is going to come out, but I think a lot of how our rural economies have changed from the time of Grandpa Jim Zimmerman to my time now is I heard all these stories about my grandpa working together with neighbors. So literally, is the reason why we were able to get electricity out to our farm. Forming cooperatives when business models, when the traditional business models didn't work. Of this sense of creative problem solving of, okay, how do I work with my neighbors to get things done? And I think when more and more, to Ben's point, gets hyper consolidated, where the small and the mid-size has no place, or the level of returns your projects need to generate to be able to attract investment capital from the outside, it can start to feel like, why try to build things when we're going to be disappointed, or when the capital will not flow here, or when you lose an entire generation of wealth in the farm crisis in the 80s, and that we're approaching right now too, of whole generations of family farms may also be lost, right? I think there's this, what erodes trust, I think sometimes is feeling helpless, and that feeling what you do together does not matter. And so I think the more we can lift up the practices already in place of business models that are innovative and creative, that require people coming together, and even if it doesn't generate the same return as an investor-owned project, that there is not just a financial return, but a social trust return, and that therefore is where the investment, and how do we get the capital sources to invest in that too?
Yeah, Yante? Oh, you're next. Sorry.
So I'll just put a comment into that, because I was talking to Mac McLennan from yesterday, who was CEO of a rural electric co-op. And what we were talking about is how that cooperative model grew up out of the Rural Electrification Act, which is seen as some of the most successful federal policy ever. And it was developed because the traditional model wasn't going to work very well. And so we were thinking about, and maybe that's something for us to be thinking about as a commission, how, and it may not be a cooperative model, maybe there are different models for healthcare or for education that, might not be the traditional method that's going to work in a larger suburban or urban area, but will be the way in which it could work in a more locally controlled way in a rural area. So just double down on that. But I also want to double down on Brent's question, because Benya, you just, again, even mentioned it, that part of the solution is going to be in migration, and part of that is an invitation to create a place of belonging, so that the trust remains a currency in that place. Is there a federal role for that? How do we create that sense of belonging for newcomers into small communities? Or frankly, in a small community, change is felt really directly by the people who live in that community, whether it's positive or negative. You just feel that change more existentially, because as there's less of you. And so just love to hear any reflections on, is there a federal role for that? Is that primarily a philanthropic role? How do we think about that? Because creating a sense of belonging is actually going to be really important for places if we're going to continue to have the trust, to use trust in a small place to do some of the things you're talking about.
I'll comment quickly on that. I think reestablishing visa program for agricultural workforce is really important. Our county, even though it's rural and very conservative, quite a ways away from the urban areas, is quite diverse because of the opportunities in the agricultural industry. And that helps our schools, because we get more students to come to our rural schools, and that increases the amount of dollars that are delivered from the state out into rural communities, and it makes our schools more efficient. It helps all the way around. It helps our churches. We have more choir members, things like that. So I think in general, probably going against the grain is that we welcome diversity, and it's a place where you don't think that diversity is welcome. But that's not the experience that I see firsthand in Stevens County, Minnesota.
Ben?
Yeah, I was just going to say, federal immigration reform is, that passed the Senate back in 2010 or 12, whatever it was, that then got stopped in the House. I mean, that was, had pathways of citizenship, and it looked at looked at agricultural visa programs, and it looked at it comprehensively. So I think that a lot of places, like federal immigration policy that actually works for business and agriculture and communities is essential to the. I mean, if you don't solve that problem, I mean, just look at the instances that are happening right now. I mean, people are. I mean, there's clearly. Obviously, there's a whole entire agricultural economy that's built on a group of workers that, I mean, we all know this. We all know the problems, right? But what's the solution? And I don't think it's to the states. That's one that clearly falls on the federal government to solve, to finally solve that issue.
I'll put my university hat on quickly, pass it on to you, but the H-1B visa program with the $100,000 fee, that's going to decimate our research programs. It's going to decimate, the workforce that's coming out of the university, and that's having an impact right now. And that's really important that that gets resolved, or a new pathway gets opened up. Even it's important for rural areas as well.
Well, and the H-1B and the H-2A, obviously, we know it's a temporary 9-month visa. Well, dairy farming is not seasonal occupation, right? So you have visa programs that just clearly don't work for agricultural, our everyday farms. So I mean, it's like we need federal immigration reform.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of triple down on that, I don't know how we've got into a place where the virtues of rule of law and immigration feel so pitted against each other, when I think if we had a common sense immigration policy that met the needs of what our demographic cliff is saying to us, and did so in a way that was lawful because it's actually trying to solve problems, like those two virtues, being open to immigration and respecting the rule of law, should not be at odds. But I think at the current political moment, it has been. And then I think that has really blocked actually effective, bipartisan legislation around that. I will also say too that, so it's like that is maybe a downstream piece, but then once you have new cultures integrating into your community, there are going to be inevitably very specific needs that different cultures coming in will need, especially if they're coming in with not a very solid economic foundation, or English is not their first language. I feel like I see southern Minnesota from the eyes of German ancestry. Like, he has no hair now, but used to have blonde hair. My dad, blonde hair, blue-eyed German ancestry father with a Thai mother. And I saw the barriers of moving to the U.S. for the first time in her 40s in terms of access to, learning how to drive, being able to access mental health resources, or navigate our insurance system with, English not being your first language. So, I think there are culturally competent supports that are needed, that needs to be taken away from an attack on DEI or like trigger language around that is really, I think, just practical of who are the people in your community, what does it take for them to be able to know how to get involved in your community so that they are contributors both to the economy but also to the social fabric. And I think it's taking a very particular pragmatic stance of like, what are those barriers, and how do we, whether it's in our education systems, healthcare systems, but also have funding that is not, doing DEI for the sake of DEI, but it's doing, meeting people where they are at with the needs that they have. And by doing that, we are all better when people feel like they are part of a socially cohesive community and unit together.
Yeah. Dante?
Yeah, that makes you make it sound so very logical, Benya. Can you talk a little bit about how you, well, I mean, the three of you all share and learn from other maybe some of your sister foundations or other parts, even in the state or outside of the state, maybe in North Dakota, and adopt some of those solutions, because there is a lot of good stuff here. I'm sure there's all great innovation and entrepreneurial spirit elsewhere too, and sometimes that non-invented here syndrome, prevents people from learning, or sometimes just bandwidth prevents people from looking outside to say, hey, have they solved it elsewhere? Can we learn from that and adapt it here? So that there is more replication and more scaling of great ideas possible.
So I'll start, if you don't mind. So one program I mentioned earlier we participated in is the Climate Smart Municipality Project. Dr. Sabina Engel, University of Minnesota Institute of the Environment, runs that program. It's the best engagement model I've seen. She matches communities, could be communities like Duluth or Rochester, Warren, Minnesota, which is a tiny community up to north, Morris, and others with German counterparts. And then there's an engagement on what are the best management practices, what works best in your communities. And it's amazing. And there's also a policy delegation with state leadership from both sides of the aisle that go to Germany and learn about their system. And it's probably not so much the interaction with the Germans and North Rhine-Westphalia, but it's the interaction amongst ourselves that's really beneficial. And that's where the information is transferred, and you kind of develop that trust, as you were talking about earlier, and you can move forward in a meaningful way in that case.
Ben?
Yeah, well, I was just going to, the municipal solar cohort program that I mentioned, that started through a network of the mayor's cohort. So we just got mayors from the region together, invited all 82 of them. Not all of them show up. So we got the coalition of the willing, the people who want to learn from one another. And we use the example of Morris, right? Like a very conservative community that had put solar on their different publicly owned buildings, and learning from, but it started out just as trust and relationship building within those mayors. And then I guess the example is that as they go through that together, the cohort. So if you're a community of a few hundred people in a rural community, if you know that the community 15 miles down the road of 500 people is also going through it, maybe it helps you go through that together, if you will. So I think that's the example of learning from one another, but not only learning from one another, but doing with one another as well.
I'll just quickly say, I have to say this because I ran a fellowship program for many years with Lead for America, the organization I had helped start, and it was, I think, where the magic happened was that you had a fellowship program that was deeply using national service, right? So AmeriCorps investments to really root deeply in local service, get people to serve the communities that they are from, that they are connected to, but then also we'd have the capacity to bring them together 4 times a year and be inspired by, okay, what's happening in Hazard, Kentucky, and how can I replicate that in Waseca? And I think being able to start that young, and have that continue in different types of, engaging in national service in that way throughout the course of your life too, helps create those locally rooted but also nationally connected nodes.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, thanks. It was great discussion. I've written down a whole bunch of things, including, attributes that I think I hear you saying, and issues that need to be resolved. But as Tony said, we can't focus on everything. We're focused on, what at the federal level we ought to be thinking about. And so I'm going to ask you a question I asked the group yesterday, which is all the things you think are necessary and appropriate for rural Minnesota. What are the top 3 constraints, and are any of them federal as a source of a constraint, right? If you want, for example, immigration reform, clearly Congress has to do it. But is that a top 3 issue? What are the top 3 constraints, and are any of them federal?
I can start with one. The focus of my research and our mission is to reduce fossil energy consumption and production in agriculture. And looking at the big picture, looking at Minnesota, how Minnesota became the state and became the state that has the most Fortune 500 companies per capita, is that we would take raw materials, we would take those to Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Duluth, and we would add value to them and ship them around the country. And that's how we started, and that's how wealth was generated. our local wealth was generated. And, I think Minnesota and the Midwest has unique opportunity to do that again. We have potential for kind of the industries of the future in agriculture. I think agriculture can lead the way, particularly with an area I work with, and green nitrogen fertilizers, e-fuels, green chemicals, all those things that are just over the horizon, or maybe even closer. But Minnesota also provides 86% of the iron ore for the country. And if you look at the youth around the world, they want to impact climate change. And even some of the CEOs of some large oil and fertilizer companies that use a lot of fossil energy tell me their kids want to see them change. And so it's coming. And so, it makes sense for an area like Minnesota to take advantage of that. I heard you're from Texas. Houston's not the energy capital because of any other reason other than early on they had a cheap source of energy. We actually have inexpensive energy here now. And so we can have that transition where we're creating chemical industries, for example, out of this inexpensive energy. We can create iron and steel out of this inexpensive energy. So a whole new industry around inexpensive, clean energy. That's my 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you.
And what's the federal role in that?
Well, he said, is there a federal role? I'm not sure there is, but it's interesting you asked the question, Thomas, because we want to make it Minnesota owned. It doesn't help when we have the existing companies come in and do it and take those resources out. It does help, but it's more beneficial if we're keep circulating those dollars in our community, as was mentioned before. One of the key aspects of that is debt financing, being able to access debt, because that's the way farmers, cooperatives, that's how they keep ownership, is being able to access the debt and pay that back over a number of years. Farmers have quite a bit of equity, but they don't like to risk that equity. And so, the grant programs, the tax incentives, all those things help to mitigate that initial risk.
I would just add to that maybe, Tony, I think that consolidation is a big thing, like we talked about it with the BNT meets, but if Mike's green ammonia at the University of Minnesota Morris, if there's a corporation from California that comes in and gets that technology and figures out how to build a plant that uses way too much water and way too much energy, that's not sustainably scaled to a community, that's not going to benefit any of the communities, the rural communities. But I think there's opportunities in Minnesota, for example. But there's some federal policy. I don't know the particulars, but I think anti-consolidation, anti-monopoly, and policies from the federal level that encourage local investment. So in Minnesota, we have a value-added loan program that was established around the ethanol industries, but farmers can get low-interest loans to buy into cooperatives that can actually be farmer-owned cooperatives that would utilize Mike's green ammonia technology that actually benefit local communities. And I think that's the opportunity, whatever the federal role plays. But if that same technology is used from a corporation in California, sorry for anyone from California, not picking on you, but if we can keep those dollars locally, it's the BN Meat story times 100, right, of what that means to a local community.
I really appreciate that you brought up that last piece, and I think there's a lot in the whole landscape of both deregulation of some policies, particularly for small and mid-sized businesses, that I think are sometimes up against the same regulatory environment as if they were, a major, large company. Right? So I think there's a role for deregulation in that. I think there's a role for antitrust enforcement. There's a role also for reviewing what subsidy programs we have across different federal agencies, of seeing, is this actually favoring a particular subdemographic of larger industry as opposed to, the actual small and mid-sized businesses. So I think there's an audit to be done across those three levers that I think the federal government has a lot of sway on all those things, with a focus of what does it look like to actually invest in local ownership and make sure that even with the demographic changes, we don't lose an entire generation of local businesses too. And just as some examples, Minnesota and Colorado, for example, both have financing programs specific to like worker-owned businesses, co-ops, and that kind of financing. So getting financing products that are specific to those needs. So that's one really big one, because I think it gets at a lot of the consolidation trends that hurt everywhere, but especially in rural. I think also it'd be interesting to look at what are the tools that we've used to invest in emerging markets overseas, both from the federal and also private sector of, there's a level of patient investment capital in emerging markets where you know that in order for the market to build, you're going to need a lot of innovation adding on top of each other. And so you're not just investing into one business that that is in a silo, right? Or a hospital, a rural hospital in a silo, but you're investing over the long run with patient capital and across multiple sectors so that emerging market in time delivers returns for you. That's, I think, what we've done in Southeast Asian markets and in African markets. What does it look like to apply that level of risk tolerance and public investment into our own maybe emerging or re-emerging markets in rural? And then third, too, I really appreciate the AI conversation earlier, and so I don't want to end without maybe speaking to how do we invest in rural capacity proactively for the economic disruptions that are happening, already happening and will continue to happen. There are a lot of conversations popping up all over the country, especially now here in Minnesota, around data center development and that connection to the role and proliferation of AI, right? So there's definitely like a skills training on the AI piece, but also infrastructure investments that if we are going to be building data centers, what does that mean for water and energy use, and do we actually have grids that are resilient to do that? So I think that's a role that the federal government can play in partnership with communities to say, what do you need to be ready for that? And that'll look like on, I think with what we saw a lot on the clean energy piece, by the time that financial investment came in some places, I could not make the case that this was actually going to be creating jobs for rural people because we had not invested proactively in the CTE education, in getting our community colleges building out those programs so that developers could come and actually hire locally. So I think there's, in a lot of rural development, it's chicken before the egg piece, right? And I think we need a federal policy that is doing both at the same time, walking and chewing gum at the same time. And I think part of that too, especially maybe on the data center piece, is, right now our landscape is you can't get federal investments if you include a community benefit agreement, which whatever you call it, I don't care what it's called, but for a community to have a fair deal at the table and to be able to have private partnerships where the developer is also investing in the workforce capacity, in the infrastructure resiliency capacity, that should not be a political thing. That should be something that is an example of the federal government supporting genuine, locally driven public-private partnership. And how do we get investments into the local community so that they're prepared to have those agreements benefit them?
Amazing. What an amazing panel. I want to just add one more thing, Tom, to your discussion. And I would say consistency. One of the real challenges that we have in federal policy is these mammoth swings where, okay, can we rely on the hydrogen hubs of the IRA?
Never mind.
Yeah, never mind. And so I think that going back to Tony's example of the REA, which I would argue one of the most successful rural development programs, you knew it was going to be there. It was built out over, 20 years? Yeah. And so, it was just kind of like everybody had bought in, and maybe there was more money or less money any given year, but there was a consistent policy that people knew they could rely on and communities knew they could rely on. And I think consistency is something we don't talk enough about in especially rural policy. It's just amazing. Panel, can we give them all our gratitude? I just want to say Minnesota is so lucky to have all of you. Yeah. People say, oh, you talk like you're from Fargo. I said, that show was never about Fargo. It was about Brainerd, Minnesota.